The first thing people ask me is why I went there alone. I usually tell them the same answer I gave everyone back then. I was filming a documentary about abandoned places. It sounds reasonable. It sounds brave. It sounds like the kind of thing someone in their 20s would do for views, curiosity, and the thrill of proving that ghosts weren't real. The truth is less impressive. I went because I wanted silence. After months of noise, traffic, deadlines, arguments, phone calls that always ended with someone disappointed in me, I found myself obsessed with places that had been forgotten. Empty factories, deserted hospitals, schools where chalkboards still held half-erased lessons from years ago. There was something strangely peaceful about buildings that no longer expected anything from the people who entered them. That school had a name once, but the locals rarely used it anymore. They simply called it the Old Hill School. It sat on the edge of a forest about 30 miles from the nearest town, hidden behind rusted gates and trees that had grown wild enough to swallow the road leading to it. Classes had stopped sometime in the early 1990s after a series of accidents no one could explain consistently. Some said a fire. Others said a structural collapse. The oldest residents would only shake their heads and change the subject. One thing was always repeated. No one stayed there after dark. I arrived just before sunset. The building looked larger than it had in the photos. 3 stories of cracked concrete and broken windows stretched across the hill like a ship that had run aground decades ago. Vines crawled up the walls. The playground swings moved slightly, even though the air was almost perfectly still. I parked my car near the entrance and checked my equipment. Camera, tripod, flashlights, extra batteries, a sleeping bag, enough food and water for one night. I remember laughing to myself as I locked the car. I was treating the place like a camping trip. The front doors were chained shut, but one of the side entrances had collapsed years earlier, leaving a gap large enough to crawl through. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed it. The smell hit next: dust, damp wood, mold, and something metallic lingering beneath it all. My flashlight swept across the entrance hall. Rows of abandoned lockers lined the walls. Most were hanging open, their doors bent outward like someone had tried to force them apart from the inside. Papers covered the floor in uneven drifts. A faded school banner still hung above the staircase. "Welcome back, students." The words were almost completely peeled away. I started recording. "Day 1, I said into the camera. "I'll be spending the night inside the abandoned Hill School. The goal is simple: document the building, explore the classrooms, and stay until sunrise." My voice echoed farther than it should have. I spent the next hour exploring the first floor. The cafeteria was filled with overturned tables. The science laboratory still contained glass beakers coated with decades of dust. In the library, thousands of books remained on the shelves, swollen from moisture and age. One children's book lay open on a desk near the window, its pages fluttering even though every window in the room was sealed. I told myself it was air pressure. I told myself old buildings behaved strangely. I told myself a lot of things. By the time darkness settled outside, I had reached the second floor. That was when I noticed the footprints. They began near the top of the staircase. Small, barefoot, pressed clearly into the dust. At first I assumed they were old, but the dust around them was undisturbed. The prints were sharp, as if they had been made only hours earlier. They walked down the hallway. I followed them with my flashlight. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, lined with identical classroom doors. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud against the cracked tile floor. The prints stopped in front of room 214. The door was slightly open. I pushed it wider. Inside, the classroom looked almost untouched compared to the rest of the building. Desks remained in neat rows. A teacher's chair sat at the front. Faded math formulas still covered the chalkboard, and on the center desk lay a single notebook. Clean, dry, not covered in dust. I approached slowly. The notebook looked new enough that it should have been impossible. I opened it. The first page was blank. The second page was blank. Then I reached the middle. One sentence had been written in dark blue ink. "You came alone." I froze. I lowered the notebook and looked around the room. Nothing. Just empty desks and broken windows reflecting the beam of my flashlight. I laughed nervously. Someone had been here recently. That was the only explanation. Maybe another explorer. Maybe teenagers. Maybe someone trying to scare visitors. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I checked the room carefully. No footprints. No sleeping bags. No food wrappers. No signs that anyone had been staying there. When I returned to the hallway, the barefoot prints were gone. Completely gone. The layer of dust was smooth again, as if no one had ever walked through it. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I decided I had seen enough for the night. The auditorium on the first floor was the safest place to sleep. It had only one main entrance, and I could easily hear anyone approaching. I set up my sleeping bag near the stage, positioned my camera to record the room continuously, and ate a quick dinner while reviewing the footage I had captured. Everything looked normal. The classrooms, the library, the hallway, even room 214. But when I reached the part where I found the notebook, my hand stopped moving. The camera clearly showed the desk. It showed me picking something up. It showed me standing there for almost a full minute. But the notebook wasn't visible. The desk was empty. I replayed the footage 3 times. I could see my hands holding something. I could see myself turning pages. I could even hear the faint sound of paper. Yet the notebook itself never appeared on camera. I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it was a recording error. Then, from somewhere deep inside the school, a bell rang. Not a loud alarm. Not a broken mechanical clang. A single clear school bell. The kind that announces the beginning of class. One ring. Then silence. I looked at my watch. It was exactly 12 a.m. A few seconds later, footsteps began walking across the floor directly above me. Slow, barefoot, and they were moving toward the auditorium stairs. The figure didn't move. Neither did I. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the auditorium was the pounding of my own heartbeat. The flashlight beam rested on the silhouette sitting in the chair. It was shaped like a person. Small. Too small to be an adult. The head tilted slightly downward, as though it were looking at the floor. Long strands of dark hair hid the face completely. I swallowed. Hello! The word barely left my mouth. The figure remained perfectly still. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The auditorium doors refused to open, and the only other exit led backstage. I took one cautious step forward. The old wooden floor groaned beneath my weight. The figure didn't react. Another step. Still nothing. The flashlight flickered again, only for a split second. When the light stabilized, the chair was empty. I froze. It hadn't stood up. It hadn't walked away. It simply wasn't there anymore. The chair rocked gently back and forth. Someone, or something, had been sitting there only moments before. A cold sensation crawled across the back of my neck. I turned slowly. Nothing behind me. Just rows of empty seats disappearing into darkness. Then, a whisper, right beside my ear. So, you stayed. I spun around so violently that I nearly dropped the flashlight. No one. The auditorium was empty. My breathing became ragged. I wasn't investigating anymore. I was surviving. I grabbed my backpack and sprinted toward the backstage exit. Unlike the main doors, this one opened immediately. I stumbled into a narrow service hallway lined with dusty storage rooms. The air felt colder here, much colder. The concrete walls were stained with moisture, and old electrical conduits ran across the ceiling like tangled vines. I kept walking. Anything was better than remaining in the auditorium. The hallway eventually connected to another staircase. According to the faded evacuation map hanging nearby, these stairs led directly to the 3rd floor. I frowned. I hadn't even realized the school had a 3rd floor. Curiosity won again. Against every rational thought, I climbed. Each step echoed unnaturally loudly. Halfway up, I noticed something strange. The dust covering the stairs had been disturbed. Not by footprints, by drag marks, thin parallel lines, as though dozens of desks had recently been pulled across the floor above. The sound reached me before I reached the landing. Scraping, wood against concrete. Slow, heavy. Again, again, again. I switched off my flashlight. The scraping stopped instantly. Silence. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. I switched the light back on. The scraping resumed immediately. My stomach tightened. Whatever was making that sound responded to the light. I continued climbing until I reached the 3rd floor hallway. It was different from the rest of the school. The walls looked cleaner. The air smelled faintly of chalk. Several fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling. One of them flickered, not because it had electricity, because something moved past it. A shadow, quick, human-sized, crossing the hallway at impossible speed. I chased after it. The corridor stretched farther than it should have. Every classroom door stood open. Inside each room, students, dozens of them, heads lowered, perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. For one impossible second, the classrooms looked alive. Children sat quietly at their desks while a teacher wrote across the chalkboard. The scratching of chalk echoed through the hallway. I blinked. Everything vanished. The rooms were empty again. Broken desks, rotting books, collapsed ceilings. Only silence remained. I backed away slowly. That's when I noticed the chalkboard in the nearest classroom. A sentence was appearing by itself. No hand. No chalk floating in the air. Just white letters slowly writing themselves. Attendance. One line appeared beneath it. Daniel. A check mark. Another line. Emily. A check mark. Another. Michael. A check mark. The list continued. 20 names. Every one received a check mark. Then the final line appeared. The chalk hesitated. Slowly, letter by letter, my own name began to form. I stood frozen. The invisible chalk finished writing it. A check mark appeared beside it. At that exact moment, every classroom door slammed shut at once. Boom, boom, boom. The entire hallway shook. The fluorescent light burst overhead. Darkness swallowed the corridor. Somewhere ahead, children began reciting in perfect unison. Present. A pause. Then louder. Present. Closer. Present. The voices were moving toward me. Not walking. Gliding. Dozens of them. I switched on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated the far end of the hallway. Rows of children stood shoulder to shoulder. Every one of them wore faded school uniforms. Every head was lowered. Every face hidden. They began raising their heads together. Slowly. Perfectly synchronized. Before the light could reach their faces, every flashlight I carried went out at exactly the same time. The last thing I heard in the darkness was a child quietly asking, "Will you stay for tomorrow's class?" The footsteps continued. Slow, measured. Each one landed with a soft, bare slap against the floorboards above the auditorium. I held my breath. 1, 2, 3. Then they stopped, directly over my head. The silence that followed felt heavier than the footsteps themselves. Even the insects outside had gone quiet. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand, not because I was cold, but because I suddenly realized how alone I truly was. Or at least, how alone I had believed I was. I grabbed my second flashlight and pointed both beams toward the staircase leading to the second floor. Nothing. No movement. No shadow. Just darkness swallowing the upper hallway. I checked my watch again. 12:03 a.m. Probably an animal, I whispered, more for my own comfort than because I believed it. A raccoon. A stray dog. Maybe part of the roof settling. Anything except the explanation my mind refused to accept. Then my camera beeped. The battery icon flashed red. Impossible. I had installed a fully charged battery less than an hour ago. I swapped it for another fresh battery from my backpack. The camera restarted, then immediately displayed the same warning. Low battery. Seconds later, it shut itself off. A cold draft swept across the auditorium. The stage curtains moved gently, despite every door and window being closed. Something creaked behind the curtain. Wood against wood. Slow. Rhythmic. As though someone had shifted their weight. I stared at the stage. The curtain barely moved now. Just enough for me to imagine someone standing behind it. Watching. Waiting. I laughed under my breath. This is exactly why people fake ghost videos, I muttered. I picked up my flashlight and walked toward the stage. Each step echoed through the empty auditorium. My own breathing sounded too loud. When I reached the curtain, I hesitated. The fabric smelled of dust and mildew. I grabbed the edge. One quick pull. The curtain slid open with a harsh scraping sound. Nothing. The stage was empty. Broken chairs. A collapsed piano. Stacks of old scenery from forgotten school plays. No person. No animal. No hiding place large enough for anyone. I exhaled slowly. Then, knock. 3 sharp knocks came from beneath the stage. I froze. The sound came again. Knock. 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 Not random. Intentional. Like someone politely asking to be let out. The stage had a small maintenance hatch near its left side. It hung slightly open. Darkness filled the narrow space beneath the platform. I crouched and shined my flashlight inside. Dust. Pipes. Wooden support beams. Nothing else. Then my flashlight flickered. Once. Twice. The beam dimmed until only a weak circle remained. And in that fading light, I saw footprints. Bare footprints. Fresh. They began deep beneath the stage. They walked toward me, but they ended halfway, as if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist. My flashlight died completely. Darkness swallowed everything. I stood perfectly still. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. Someone else's. Slow. Calm. Only a few feet away. I reached for my backup flashlight with shaking hands. The moment I switched it on, the space beneath the stage was empty again. No footprints. No breathing. Nothing. I backed away immediately. Every instinct told me to leave. To grab my equipment. Run to the car. Forget the documentary. Forget the footage. Just leave. I reached the auditorium doors. Pulled the handle. It wouldn't move. I pulled harder. Still locked. I knew for a fact I had never locked it. Panic finally replaced curiosity. I slammed my shoulder against the door. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The old wood didn't even shake. As I stepped backward, trying to understand what was happening, the school bell rang again. One clear tone. Except this time, it wasn't alone. A second bell answered it somewhere farther away. Then a third. Then dozens. Bells echoed throughout the entire building. Class change. Exactly as if hundreds of students had just been dismissed. The hall outside exploded with sound. Footsteps. Running. Laughter. Lockers slamming. Teachers shouting muffled instructions. The noise was so real that I instinctively looked through the narrow window in the auditorium door. The hallway was completely empty, yet the sounds continued. Children laughed directly outside. Someone sprinted past the door. A girl's voice whispered, "He's still here." Every sound stopped at once. The silence returned so suddenly it made my ears ring. Then came one final sound, a slow creak. Behind me, I turned toward the stage. One of the old wooden chairs that had been lying on its side was now standing upright, facing me, and someone was sitting in it. Only their silhouette was visible, perfectly still, as if they had been waiting for me to look back.